The name sounds like a fairy tale told behind closed doors. The Pleasure Squad. But the story is not made of silk and laughter. It's made of fear, secrecy, and the collision of spectacle with suffering in a country that perfected both theater and silence. There is a phrase in Korean gippeumjo joy group or pleasure squad, depending on who is brave enough to translate it, and it exists, if it exists at all, at the edge of what can be proven, and what can only be whispered by those who ran far enough to risk remembering out loud. This is a film about women whose names hardly appear in any archive, whose lives were choreographed like a state ceremony, and whose stories, when they surface, arrive in fragments, the way truth must when truth is dangerous. The story doesn't begin with one man, though that would be simpler. It winds back through decades to a founding leader who built a country around myth and devotion, and who allegedly built an inner world of performance and pleasure designed to orbit him. Then his son, then his grandson. They called it Kippumjo. Sometimes a troupe of dancers and musicians, sometimes masseuses, sometimes something that nobody says aloud until the room is closed and the recorder is off. And the numbers echo like a rumor that never dies. 2,000, selected for beauty, poise, youth. In the 1970s, as the story goes, the first squads were assembled. Recruiters visited schools and festivals, always with the state's immaculate smile, noting height, face, posture, the grace of a bow that, if you weren't careful, could become a lifetime. A defector once described being chosen in high school, trained for 6 months, not in politics, not in engineering, but in the art of pleasing, to sing "Yao," to dance, to serve tea, to massage, and sometimes to do what no language can decorate without lying about what it is. These accounts say recruits were often teens, 15 to 19. They were taught to waltz with ministers and laugh at the leaders' jokes. They were told that service was an honor, a rare appointment, a family security sealed in a girl's silence. On paper, the state promised a better life. Appliances, stipends, favors, small empires of domestic comfort meant to dignify what could not be dignified, because even velvet can be a gag when placed carefully enough. But there is another ledger written without ink. The cost of being a symbol in a country that worships symbols, of being expected to live like a national secret, and to disappear like one too when the anthem ends. When Kim Il-sung died, the machine did not stop. It adapted, as all machinery does under dynasties. Kim Jong-il allegedly kept his own orbit of performers, rehearsals, late-night parties where the music never had an off switch as long as the lights stayed on in the palaces. And then, in 2011, as the boy king ascended and the old guard trembled, reports said the squads were disbanded, not in confession, but in housekeeping. Women asked to sign their lives shut, given money and gifts, returned to hometowns like retired ghosts with no permission to haunt. A few years later, there were reports that recruiting began again, like a theater reopening under new management, casting calls whispered in school corridors, and training said to resume in Pyongyang's hotels where chandeliers learn to keep secrets too. The facts come to us like a flicker. Chosun Ilbo here, defectors there, a chef who claimed to have watched the private stage where the ruling family fed on spectacle, where even intimacy was part of protocol, as if desire could be centrally planned. There's a reason the archive is thin. North Korea is a fortress against proof, and what escapes it tends to wear the scars of rumor. Yet patterns recur, names align, dates match like distant drums, and the human details arrive the way real memory does. Odd, specific, strangely practical. One defector said the recruitment felt like a medical exam for a role no one dared define. Another said training was precise like military drill, except the weapons were smiles and choreography. The targets were powerful men, and the battlefield was a room with soft chairs. To understand this, you have to understand the country that made it plausible. A place where women are celebrated in propaganda and cornered in practice, saluted as heroic mothers, and mobilized as laborers, then left to absorb the invisible costs of loyalty in the dark. Listen long enough to defectors and their stories widen beyond any one Agha squad, the military where basic hygiene is a luxury, where abuse hides inside hierarchy, detention centers where sexual violence is not a rumor but a routine, borders where a woman's body becomes a passport that never gets stamped, Some of those who made it out say the first night of safety feels unreal, the way quiet feels to someone who has only known alarms. They cry not because anything hurts, but because the absence of hurt is new enough to sting. Meanwhile, the regime insists on its righteousness, and the world negotiates missiles and famines. Human rights are often a footnote, even though the footnote is where the human beings live and where the truth of a place is most legible. In recent years, one woman prepared to take the unimaginable step, to sue the state she fled, to name the leader and officials in a court that may never reach them, to turn a whispered history into a public record, even if the verdict is only symbolic, even if the symbolism is the point. And yet, for all the telling, there is so much that cannot be told. The pleasure squad may always remain partly myth and partly map, an outline drawn by those who escaped, filled in by journalists, scholars, and readers who must keep two truths at once. That doubt is necessary, and that disbelief can be its own form of cruelty. What does it mean to be chosen for joy in a system that monetizes fear? To be 18 and taught to pour a drink with just the right wrist, to laugh at just the right decibel, to never misread the room when the room is the only country that matters. What does it mean to retire at 23? To marry a man who has no idea what the state instructed your hands to learn? To keep a secret in a town where secrets are currency and surveillance is weather? An expert once said that in such systems, theater is governance. What happens on stage is not entertainment, but enforcement. And the actors wear costumes not to disguise themselves, but to show the audience what role they must play when the curtain falls. The pleasure squad. If that is the name we choose to keep, becomes part of that theater, a ritual of proximity to power, an annual reminder that the state can select Polish and vanish anyone, and that even joy can be requisitioned like grain. There are details that stick: the rumored numbers, the hotel training, the stipends and home appliances, domestic rewards as consolation prizes for the theft of a private life, a washing machine as a medal for unrecorded service. And there are the contradictions. A nation that declared gender equality, that drafted women into images of strength, then built corridors where strength was never the point, where the body is not a citizen but an instrument tuned to a leader's song. Here is the hardest part. The line between myth and memory is not always a line. It is often a fog, and the fog itself is policy. The uncertainty is a feature, a shield, a way to exhaust anyone trying to care long enough to notice. So what remains for the listener is an ethical task: to hold the rumor and the record together, to care about the women even if their names are missing, to understand that the absence of paperwork is not the absence of pain. The women who spoke gave us enough: the age, the training, the duties as wide as a ballroom, and as narrow as a bed, the promise of gifts, the end of the line where silence is paid for, receipt attached, history erased. And there are those who never had anything to do with any squad, who still carry the same grammar of harm. Soldiers whose bathrooms were forests, detainees whose bodies were instruments of confession, mothers whose only crime was crossing a river with a child and no passport. If there is a twist, it is this: the story we tell about pleasure is not about pleasure at all. It's about power naming itself as joy and requiring everyone else to nod along. It's about a system that can choreograph even the heartbeat of a room. Maybe one day the archives will open, and the ledger will balance, and we will learn every name that was ever rehearsed into a smile. Maybe a museum will stand where a hotel once stood, and a docent will point to a chandelier and say, "This is where truth learned to whisper." Until then, the film ends here, with a thought that refuses to end. The opposite of propaganda is not information, it is intimacy. And if we sit with these lives long enough, even in the fog, we might learn to tell the difference between a rumor engineered to mislead and a memory trying to survive. If you were chosen for joy, but joy was a uniform, would you still recognize the sound of your own laughter when the music stopped? If your hands were trained to soothe men who could move armies, could those same hands hold a child and feel clean again? A woman once said the first night of safety felt like drowning in air. She hugged her daughter and cried, not because she was sad, but because living had finally chosen her back. And that is all the verdict some people ever get in this world. So remember the word gippeumjo, joy, turned inside out by the state. Remember the squad that may always be partly invisible. And remember that the work of seeing is not only to gather proof, but to keep a place in the imagination for those who had theirs taken from them. And if there is justice, it may begin the way it did for one defector. Not with a knock at the leader's door, but with a case filed in a world that cannot compel North Korea, and still chooses to speak because speaking is sometimes all that keeps the silence from winning. This has never been a story about one man's appetite. It is a story about a country's system, about a theater where the audience claps because the lights never come up, and about the women who carried the show until it carried them away. In the end, if there is a lesson, it is small and enormous. That intimacy coerced is not intimacy. That joy requisitioned is not joy. And that a nation can be measured by how softly it lets its daughters sleep.